Crescent Moon Club, in conjunction with Cyclops Entertainment, in association with ABT presents Omnibus Unlimited, a roundtable discussion program with subjects that must be addressed. Radiovision for the 21st century. Hello everybody, I'm John Horrigan, producer and creator of Omnibus Unlimited. Tonight we're going to talk about saucer crashes in Indio, Spitsbergen, and Las Vegas. From the book UFO Crash at Roswell by Kevin D. Randle and Donald R. Schmitt. December 1950, Del Rio, Texas. The second legitimate crash seems to be the one claimed near Del Rio, Texas. Like Roswell, there are first-hand witnesses to this report. One researcher has identified more than 24 military men, including Colonel Robert Willingham, who were involved in the retrieval. In 1977, Willingham went on the record describing his handling of the wreckage. In a signed affidavit, he stated, "Down in Dyess Air Force Base in Texas, we were testing what turned out to be the F-94. They reported on the scope that they had an unidentified flying object at a high speed going to intercept our course. It came visible to us and we watched it and we wanted to take off after it. Headquarters wouldn't let us go after it and then played around a bit. We got to watching how it made 90-degree turns at this high speed and everything. We knew it wasn't a missile of any type. And so then we confirmed it with the radar control system on the DEW line, which is NORAD, and they kept following it, and they claimed that it crashed somewhere off between Texas and the Mexican border. We got a light aircraft, me and my co-pilot, and we went down to the site. We landed out in the pasture right across from where it hit. We got out and then stood over there. They told us to leave and everything else, and then the armed guards came out and they started to form a line around the area. So on the way back I saw a little piece of metal, so I picked it up and brought it back with me. There were two sand mounds that came down, and it looked to me like this thing crashed right in between them, but it went into the ground according to the way the people were acting around it. So we never did actually get up to the site to see what had crashed, but you could see for, I'd say 300 to 500 yards where it had went across the sand. It looked to me, I guess, from the metal that we found, the chunks of metal, that it either had a little explosion or that it began to disintegrate somehow. Something caused this metal, though, to come apart. That was evident. After leaving the crash site, Willingham and his co-pilot examined the metal. It looked like it was something that was made because it was honeycombed. You know how you would make a metal that would cool faster? Well, in a way it looked like a magnesium steel, but it had a lot of carbon in it. I tried to heat it with a cutting torch, but it just wouldn't melt. A cutting torch burns at anywhere from 3,200 to 3,800 degrees Fahrenheit, and it would make the metal hot, but it wouldn't even start to make the metal yield. Willingham took the metal to a Marine Corps metallurgy lab in Hagerstown, Maryland for analysis. Several days later, he was told the man he had contacted at the lab never worked there, and no one else at the lab knew anything about the piece of metal. Willingham was ordered never to discuss it again and signed an oath of secrecy. Warren A. Smith also knew of a first-hand witness to the information. A man Smith worked with was receiving letters from his wife at a dude ranch in Texas. He wrote that they had seen a fiery crash and that the cowboys were going to ride out to see if it had been an airplane. They returned with a story of a flying saucer and the dead pilot. According to sources, there was a fight over the jurisdiction since the craft had crashed in Mexico, but apparently the Americans won out. The craft and the occupant were removed to a base in Texas. Although not as well documented as the Roswell case, there is good reason to believe that something extraordinary happened here. Go to the UFO Casebook by Captain Kevin D. Randle, USAF, retired. December 6, 1950, El Indio, Mexico. For Randle, the story of a second crash disk came from not the briefing paper prepared for President-elect Eisenhower, but from a friend. He was a young man in 1950 and was working with a manufacturer, installing new linotype machines at newspapers. He traveled around the country doing it, and in December 1950 found himself in Lorain, Ohio. Crew that ran the print shop and set the type ate lunch about the same time and in the same place. Smith wasn't that interested in eating lunch with middle-aged men when there were young, unattached women all around, but he found himself in that situation more often than not. One of those men had a wife who was on a dude ranch in Texas for a brief vacation. Every day she wrote her husband, and every day he read the letters to anyone who would listen. The first weren't that interesting, but then one day she wrote that they had seen something unusual in the sky. It appeared to be an airplane in trouble, and the next day several of the cowboys were going to ride out to see what they could find. The next day there was another letter. The cowboys had ridden out and located the wreckage. The only problem was that they didn't think that it was an aircraft. There were bodies found, but they were so badly burned that no one could be sure what they had been. The only comment made was that it looked as if the ship had been piloted by children. Now everyone was interested in this story. Unlike the Roswell incident where almost no one had heard of flying saucers, everyone in 1950 had. The conclusion drawn by the men in the lunchroom was that the cowboys had stumbled onto the remains of a flying disc, complete with crew. Naturally, there was a great deal of speculation about the nature of the craft, where it came from, and there were a couple of men who wanted to believe that it was an experimental aircraft that had gone down. Others argued as strongly that it was something that had been built on another world. The problem was that no one knew enough about the current technology of the aviation industry to know if the lightweight metals were something that couldn't have been manufactured here on Earth. The final installment in the story was a report that it had indeed been an aircraft accident. The cowboys, having returned to the crash site, found it crawling with Mexican and American government officials and military officers. There seemed to be some kind of fight going on between the two official groups as they argued jurisdiction. No one seemed to know if it was an American plane or a Mexican plane. The cowboys were chased off before they could get too close. That was the end of it, and Schmitt forgot about it. He wasn't interested in UFOs at the time. He couldn't have cared whether the cowboys had found a flying saucer or the remains of a downed airplane. It wasn't until Randle saw a copy of the briefing paper prepared for Dwight D. Eisenhower that Randle thought about the story again. Like so many other pieces of the UFO puzzle, Kevin Randle didn't know the significance of the story when he first heard it. After all, he had heard the stories of crashed saucers almost from the day that he had expressed interest in them. Then Randle didn't believe in them. Frank Scully and his little men had soared on him the notion that UFO crashes were real. But then Randle saw the briefing paper, and there is a story of a possible crash on the Texas-Mexican border about the time the woman was writing letters to her husband. She would have no reason to make up the story, and no reason to assume that it would never ever be heard. For all she knew, her letters were read in privacy. A hoax on her part made absolutely no sense. Now there is the briefing paper. It tells of a crash in the same area at the same time. If the briefing paper was a hoax, the man or woman writing it would have no knowledge of the woman who wrote her husband. If it is a hoax, there is an extraordinary coincidence there. Two unrelated people, separated by thousands of miles and 30 years, make up a story of a crashed saucer in the same area. It's especially interesting when it's remembered that almost all the stories of crashed saucers put them into Arizona or New Mexico. For Randle, it was the final nail in the coffin. Couple it to the information about the Air Force sergeant who told him about faking UFO sighting solutions, and it makes a solid package. His information confirms that something unusual happened in Roswell, and this new story confirms something happened near El Indio, Mexico. And both of those tend to prove that the briefing paper is not a hoax. More research is needed, and there are pieces of the briefing paper that have not been released, but we're getting closer to the answers that the government hasn't had for over 40 years. We go to UFO Crash at Roswell. September 12, 1952, Spitsbergen Island, possible hoax. According to press reports, Norwegian soldiers had found a disc-shaped object crashed in the snowy wastes of Spitsbergen Island. Project Blue Book files show that on September 12, 1952, the Air Force received word that the crash story was a hoax. John Keel, a well-known UFO writer, confirmed to his satisfaction in 1967 that it was a hoax. The original story, according to both the Air Force and Keel, which appeared in a West German magazine, was that the craft contained Russian writing, logbooks in Russian, and that it could fly 20,000 kilometers without refueling. There were other reports about Spitsbergen, but they bore no resemblance to the case as the Air Force had related it. The September 5, 1955 issue of the Stuttgarter Tageblatt told of a badly damaged disc being found in 1952 and that the U.S. and British experts were brought in to study it. Then, in 1955, in a story datelined Oslo, Norway, they told of a board of inquiry of the Norwegian General Staff that was preparing for the publication of a report on the examination of the remains of a UFO that had crashed on Spitsbergen Island. Colonel Gernot Darnable, who headed the investigation, reported that the Spitsbergen disk was not built by any country on Earth. The materials used in the construction are completely unknown to all experts who participated in the investigation, according to Darnable. The findings of the board were not going to be published until some sensational facts have been discussed with U.S. and British officials, according to the newspaper. Darnable also claimed that the disc had been falsely identified as Soviet by someone at the Pentagon in Washington. That means the story in the Blue Book files about the crash being a hoax could be wrong, and it could also mean that John Keel made a mistake when he did his research in 1967. Like so many cases in the field, this one must be reviewed. From Strange World by Frank Edwards comes this one. It's called UFO Explodes over Nevada. If the night skies of the United States were invaded by an unidentified craft, if that craft were to be tracked by radar across a dozen states, and if that craft or a similar one were to land beside an electric power station and put it out of operation for nearly 40 minutes, that should certainly constitute front-page news from coast to coast. And if that same object or craft then took off, pursued by armed jet interceptors which chased it until it exploded in the air over the continental United States, that should certainly be one of the big stories of the year. Well, all of these things happened on the night of April 18th, 1962, and were confirmed by official spokesmen for the Strategic Air Command and the U.S. Air Force, but the story was suppressed on or by the news services. Fortunately, the Las Vegas, Nevada Sun checked the story and gave it front-page banner headlines it deserved. Here is the full, incredible story, which most of the American public never heard of, either because the news services did not make it available, or because their local newspapers, brainwashed by Air Force propaganda, were unwilling to print it. About 7:30 p.m. on the night of April 18, 1962, something exploded over southwestern Nevada. It shook the earth. It was as brilliant as an atomic blast, which it may have been. The roar made the earth tremble for miles around. What was it? The Las Vegas Sun went right to work on that aspect of this remarkable incident. Was it just another of the strange objects which would be explained away as nothing more than a meteorite meeting its fiery doom as it thundered into the atmosphere? The reporter who called Nellis Air Force Base evidently took them by surprise, for he was told, "There's only one thing wrong with that, the meteor supposition. A meteor cannot be tracked on radar, and this thing was." Tracked on radar? That's what the spokesman at Nellis Air Force Base said. How much radar tracking had been done on this strange glowing object before it exploded over the Mesquite Range in Nevada? The logical place to make that inquiry was of the North American Air Defense Command Center at Colorado Springs, Colorado, the nerve center for aerial protection of the continental United States. Incidentally, ionized trails of meteors, but not the meteors themselves, can be tracked by radar. Well, the spokesman there on that memorable night of April 18, 1962, was Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Rolfe. He told newsmen that the Air Defense Command had been alerted by the fire trail of this strange object. The first report had come from Oneida, New York, where watchers had detected a glowing red object moving deeper into the United States, and apparently at great altitude. Was it a meteor? A missile? An enemy aircraft? Radar picked it up, so it could not have been a meteor. Was it a missile? It was traveling too slowly to be a missile. An enemy aircraft? Not at that altitude, where even our rocket-powered X-15 could not fly more than a few minutes. Technically, then, this was an unidentified flying object, which had to be kept under close surveillance, if possible. It may be pure coincidence, of course, but unidentified flying object, or UFO, is the Air Force's official name for the so-called flying saucers. As the intruder penetrated deeper into the Midwest, the Air Defense Command admittedly alerted its bases, including Nellis Air Force Base, and jet interceptors had been hurriedly scrambled from Phoenix to intercept, if possible, the disconcerting and possibly dangerous aerial intruder. This official admission from the Air Defense Command emphasizes that the object under pursuit was not a meteor. Reports poured in as the thing sped westward from Oneida, New York, then from Gridley, Kansas, and then from Utah, Montana, New Mexico, Wyoming, Arizona, and finally California. In Nephi, Utah, about 90 miles west of Salt Lake City, observers said the glowing red thing passed directly overhead on a horizontal course from east to west. Rumbling sounds were heard by many. If the jets had reached the path of the intruder, they were evidently blacked out, for none of the witnesses reported seeing any planes. This does not rule out the possibility that the jets were there, however, for it was quite dark and their passage might have produced the strange rumblings that were reported. The Air Defense Command said that the object under pursuit vanished from its radar screens at a point about 70 miles northwest of Las Vegas, which coincided with the location of the brilliant explosion that took place somewhere above the Mesquite Range in the desolate area of south of Reno. The flash was so bright that the streets of Reno were lighted as though by a gigantic photographic flashbulb. The flash was also seen at points in California by witnesses who presumed that it was an atomic air test shot over Nevada. However, that was ruled out when the Atomic Energy Commission flatly declared that there were no nuclear tests underway anywhere on the North American continent, airborne or otherwise. Thus far, the story was the official admission that some kind of red glowing unidentified flying object had been tracked from New York to Nevada by radar, and that armed jet interceptors were after it when the thing vanished from the radar screens following a brilliant and terrifically violent aerial explosion over western Nevada. The second chapter to this interesting and important story came to light a few hours later, when the United Press News Service informed some of its subscribers that a huge object of unknown identity had landed near an electric power station at Eureka, Nevada. The Las Vegas Sun went right back to work by renewing their questions of the Air Force spokesman, some of whom were showing a reluctance to discuss the matter further. But the spokesman at Stead Air Force Base in Reno admitted that the UP story about the landing was correct. The spokesman declined to say what the nature of the object had been, but he did admit that the landing had taken place and that the electric power station had been put out of operation by what he called the impact of the thing. He also admitted that news of this incident had been withheld until the power station had been restored to service. An unidentified flying object crossed most of the United States that night. An unidentified object landed beside an electric power station at Eureka, Utah, and the station was out of operation for more than a half hour. The nature of the object which landed with such alleged impact was not revealed because the object did not remain there. The jets were pursuing an unidentified flying object over southwestern Nevada after the Eureka incident, when the object exploded in a blinding flash which resembled an atomic explosion. A fascinating story, an important story, but outside of the readers of the Las Vegas Sun and a few other regional papers, the American public never heard of it. All the news management is not done by the government. There are times, it seems, when news agencies themselves miss out on stories such as this one, either because they were not furnished with the material or because they were unwilling to carry it if they got it. On this one, we go back to the UFO Case book by Kevin Randle. The remote regions of New Mexico, where no one except a few select have seen anything, aren't the only places where UFO crashes have been reported. On April 18, 1962, an object was reported to have exploded over the deserts of Nevada. The roar was heard for miles, and the flash of light was so bright that it lit the streets of Reno like the noonday sun. A report of the incident was carried in the Las Vegas Sun, and Frank Edwards wrote about it in one of his UFO books. The story actually began near Oneida, New York. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Rolfe, a spokesman for the North American Air Defense Command in Colorado Springs, Colorado, told reporters that the first observers had seen a glowing red object heading to the west over the Oneida area. It was at great altitude. Radar picked up the object. Operators watched as it streaked into the Midwest, and the Air Defense Command alerted a number of bases, including Nellis and Las Vegas. Interceptors were scrambled from Phoenix. In Nephi, Utah, witnesses reported the glowing red object flew overhead. When it was gone, there was a rumbling like that from jet engines. That might have been the interceptors as they chased the UFO.
The UFO came down near Eureka, Utah, and interrupted the electrical service from a power plant close to the landing site. It took off a few minutes later, continuing on towards the west. The object suddenly disappeared from the radar screens 70 miles northeast of Las Vegas. That coincided with reports of a brilliant explosion. So many of Frank Edwards' stories are impossible to check. Edwards wrote from the memory, and sometimes his memory let him down. The Las Vegas crash was one of the stories that I worried about because most of the major researchers knew nothing about this case. Well, my worries evaporated, however, when I interviewed a man who was in Eureka, Utah, that night that the object landed. This is Kevin D. Randle speaking, incidentally. According to the source, he was traveling south when he saw the object coming down. It wasn't just a bright light, but an oval-shaped orange object that was making a quiet whirring sound. The ground around it was lighted as if the sun was coming up. The man said that the UFO came from the east, landed, then took off and continued on to the west, disappearing in the distance. Edwards claimed that some people heard a roar that he attributed to fighters in the air giving chase. Randall's source didn't hear or see these jets, though. He continued on to his destination, stopping in the larger cities, buying newspapers, and searching for stories of the saucer sighting. He found nothing, though he continued to look. Only Frank Edwards had mentioned the case. Reports of the story were missing from most newspapers, just as the source had said. Only the Las Vegas Sun reported it. The whole story was pieced together from various sources, and it seems to be just one more example of how fast the public relations machinery can be put into motion. With the exception of the one story in the Las Vegas Sun, the majority of the country heard nothing about this. That confirmed part of the case, but Randle still wasn't completely convinced. He had read in one book where all the information about a case was written down in the local police department for anyone who cared to check. So Randle cared to check and found that the statement was absolutely wrong. Police records did not support the author's claim, so he decided to read the Las Vegas Sun for himself. The date was April 18th, and he asked to see that paper. Naturally, there was nothing about the story in the paper for that date. The next day, however, on April 19th, it had a banner headline with giant type that proclaimed, "Brilliant red explosion flares in Las Vegas sky." There was a front-page story confirming what Edwards had said. There are also the names of a few Las Vegas people who had witnessed the explosion, and the name of a police officer who had taken a search party into the mountains to look for possible wreckage. Randle looked the names up in the Las Vegas phone book, but couldn't find them, so he called the newspaper and spoke to one of the reporters there. When Randle told her that he was researching a story on UFOs carried by them, she suddenly turned cold. She told him that she'd never seen anything to suggest that UFOs were real, but if Randle wanted to believe, that was his own business. So he mentioned the story had been carried in the Las Vegas Sun, the very paper that she was working for. "It's all hearsay," she said. "But it was in your paper," Randle said. "All hearsay," she said. "The first thing I learned in Journalism 101 was that you couldn't believe anything you read." Well, Randle thought that was a strange attitude for a reporter. She was telling him that he couldn't believe anything that he read in her newspaper, but he ignored that. Instead, he asked her about the Sun staff photographer who was quoted as seeing the explosion. She told Randle that he no longer worked there and that she didn't know what had happened to him. Randle asked the police officer and was told that he was probably dead. Realizing that she was too caught up in her own opinions to worry about facts, Randle got off the phone as quickly as possible. Frank Maggio, the staff photographer, wasn't mentioned in the phone book, but there was a Maggio photo lab. It had to be the same guy. And it was. He confirmed that he had seen the object over Las Vegas, but it was so long ago that he remembered almost nothing about it. A bright light, orange, and that's about it. The police officer was harder to find. 2 phone calls, but Randle managed to locate the police officer as well. He confirmed that he had taken a search party out into the area between Mesquite, Nevada, and Spring Mountain. They searched through the night on foot and in jeeps, and the next morning they used aircraft, but they found nothing. Both Maggio and the police officer confirmed something had exploded over the Las Vegas skies. There was enough of a doubt about it to send out search parties, but when no aircraft were reported missing, the search was halted. The Project Blue Book files do contain some information on the case. According to them, the Las Vegas incident was a radar case, confirmed the object was tracked by radar, and was listed as insufficient data for a scientific analysis. The Eureka case was listed as a meteor and was dated April 19th, 1962. The only thing wrong is that meteors can't be tracked by radar. it was seen to race across the country, and to have lit up the streets of Reno and explode over Las Vegas, it would have to make a turn of at least 120 degrees, and it was seen to touch down in Eureka and take off again, not the actions of a meteor. So once again, like Roswell, we are left with a series of questions that have no answers. Did Scully, reporting what Newton and Gebauer told him, tell us a little truth? Maybe not three saucers and maybe not with bodies of perfect little humans, but something that they, Newton and Gebauer, had heard embellished to make it more exciting? And what about this exploding object over Las Vegas? If the Air Force wouldn't label it as a meteor and there were no reports of missing aircraft, what could it have been? Does the Air Force know and refuse to talk, or are they as puzzled as the rest of us? Finally, from UFO Crash at Roswell, April 18th, 1962, Las Vegas, Nevada. On April 18th, 1962, an object was reported to have exploded over the deserts of Nevada. The roar was heard for miles, and the flash of light was so bright that it lit the streets of Reno like the noonday sun. The story actually began near Oneida, New York. A spokesman for the North American Air Defense Command in Colorado Springs, Colorado, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Rolfe, told reporters that the first observers had seen a glowing red object heading to the west over the Oneida area. It was at a great altitude. Radar picked up the object. Operators watched as it streaked above the Midwest, and the Air Defense Command alerted a number of Air Force bases, including Nellis in Las Vegas, and interceptors were scrambled from Phoenix. In Nephi, Utah, witnesses reported the glowing red object flew overhead. When it was gone, there was a rumbling like that from jet engines. That might have been the interceptors as they chased the UFO. The UFO landed near Eureka, Utah, and interrupted the electrical service from a power plant close to the landing site. The craft took off a few minutes later, continuing on towards the west. The object suddenly disappeared from the radar screens 70 miles northwest of Las Vegas. That coincided with the reports of a brilliant explosion. The original report came from Frank Edwards. So many of Frank Edwards' stories were impossible to check. Edwards wrote from memory, and sometimes his memory let him down. Las Vegas crash presented problems because most of the major UFO researchers knew nothing about the case. That ended, however, when a man who was in Eureka, Utah, the night the object landed, was interviewed. According to the source, he was traveling south when he saw the object coming down. It wasn't just a bright light, but an oval-shaped orange object that was making a quiet whirring sound. The ground around it was lighted as if the sun was coming up. The man said that the UFO came from the east, landed, then took off and continued on to the west, disappearing in the distance. Edwards claimed that the others heard a roar that he attributed to fighters in the air giving chase. The source didn't hear the jets and didn't see them. He continued on to his destination, stopping in the larger cities, buying newspapers and searching for stories of the saucer sighting. He found nothing, though he continued to look. Only Frank Edwards had mentioned the case. Reports of the story were missing from most newspapers, just as the source had said. Only the Las Vegas Sun reported it. In that report, two individuals who had seen the object were named. Both men were living in the Las Vegas area. One confirmed his description of an orange craft. The other talked about the search he led to look for wreckage. Nothing was found. One man, who refused to be identified, claimed that he had been stationed at Nellis Air Force Base at the time of the crash. He had been awakened and, along with 30 other officers, was driven out into the desert. The men were used to clean a field filled with debris. They used flashlights as they crawled on their hands and knees from one end to the other. As the sun came up, the men were loaded onto a bus. The windows had been covered with dark paper. The source said that he could see through a place where the paper didn't quite cover the entire window. Through that, he could see a smashed, disc-shaped craft. At the base, the men were all debriefed. They were warned about telling anyone about anything they had seen. According to the officer in charge, the men had recovered wreckage from a secret craft that crashed. Anything said about it could help the Soviets determine the direction of research. The whole story was pieced together from various sources and seems to be just one more example of how fast the public relations machinery can be put into motion to suppress the data. With the exception of the story in the Las Vegas Sun, the majority of the country heard nothing about this. Well, that concludes our Omnibus Unlimited for tonight about the UFO crashes in Spitsbergen Island, also in El Indio, Mexico, and finally Las Vegas, Nevada. Omnibus Unlimited is a presentation of the Crescent Moon Club. It is a production of ABT. That concludes our Omnibus Unlimited for tonight about the UFO crashes in Spitsbergen Island, also in El Indio, Mexico, and finally Las Vegas, Nevada. Omnibus Unlimited is a presentation of the Crescent Moon Club. It is a production of ABT. Thanks for listening. I'm John Horrigan. We'll see you next week, everybody. Take care.